Hi everyone. I'm determined to do a quick video of the slides for this week. So let's get right to it. Um, so the Middle Ages is the period that we're covering for this unit, and so this is going to be a huge amount of time, right? So we're starting in around 410 ACE, and this is going to be with the withdrawal of the Romans from Britain, and so we're marking this not at the beginning of their withdrawal, but kind of when they were fully out. And then we are going all the way to 1485. And so this is going to be when um, Henry VII is ending the War of the Roses. 1485. So about 1,000 years. It is just this huge time period. And as a result, you're going to see that there are so many things we could have read. There's so many other things we could have focused on in this unit. And I'm just trying to do my best to cover the things that I think you want to make sure you have a little bit of knowledge about in the future, or just kind of that I think are interesting and important. Okay, so 450. This is going to be when the Anglo-Saxons come into Britain, and there's, dispute about if they're invading or if they're immigrating or how you want to look at it. What we know, though, is that they brought in sort of a prototype, like an early version of Old English. And so this is going to be important in terms of us thinking about our literature that we're going to be reading. This is also going to be 450 to 500. Around that is going to be when we have the legend of King Arthur originating. And so that's going to come back. It's going to be important. And so, just kind of keep that in mind. That's kind of when we start to have that. And 597, this is when we're going to have Christianity really getting spread in Britain. And this is going to be the result of a monk coming, being sent by the Pope to Britain to convert people, and also of Irish missionaries who are sent out. Britain is going to become majority Christian again. Then 793, I'm just going to rush through these times. This is going to be Danelaw Britain. And so, and I might be mispronouncing that, but this is going to be when we have North Scandinavian languages and culture going to be really influencing Britain. We're going to see the influences of this time period for sure with some of the works that we're going to read. Yeah, we have, and just kind of this idea of the Vikings coming into Britain during this time period. And they're going to be there for a long time. Them in 1066, and this is a date that is just like rings in my ear because my English literature survey professor was like 1066, Battle of Hastings. It just like sticks in my brain. This is when we are going to have what we call Norman Britain. And this is going to be our big French influence. And so this is where French is going to be spoken in the court, royal and legal, and so French is going to be majorly influencing English language and culture. Then English is going to make its comeback in 1362. It's going to be a little bit before that. It's going to start kind of trickling back in when there's this sort of dispute over this. I think it's Edward II or Edward III. He's trying to claim the French throne. They make battles. They sort of lose this French land and everything, and then the British become more and more like sort of patriotic about English. So with 1362, we're going to have the Pleading of English Act, which means that legal proceedings would be in English. Now, this version of English is going to be very different from the Old English that we saw, especially that version that we saw back in 450. It's going to be pretty pronounced different. And that's going to be in large part because of the other languages and cultures that had come in between. And so, especially French is going to be breaking down some of the more complex structures of Old English, which we can talk about more in a second. And then finally, 1485, just 1,000 years later. This is where we're going to have the end of the Middle Ages in England as we're going to mark it for the class. It's somewhat an arbitrary date, just like 410 or 420 is an arbitrary date, depending on which textbook I'm looking at, for saying it's the beginning of the Middle Ages. But these are times that we can sort of say, this is sort of it. And these are the dates we can agree on. Once we have more precise historical record, we're able to at least put a date to something that makes us feel good. With 410 and 420, we're like, I think it was around this time, and we really just don't know. Okay, so thinking about Old English and Middle English. So Old English, we're going to be seeing in some of our texts this unit such as our reading this week, Dream of the Rood. If you look at this, this is from the original manuscript. Um, and if you look at this, this is the text that is in a font that I can actually recognize. That said, I still can't really read this. This Old English is it's technically English, but this is such a it's such a different language at this point. And honestly, I know German, this is closer to German, at least as far as I'm seeing. This word bewundern here, starting with B, ending with EN, this W, all of this looks very German. It might be found, right? I don't know. Um, but so looking at this, I'm thinking, I can't read this. People take classes in Old English so that they can read these texts, but it's certainly not an English that we're going to be familiar with and that we'll be reading in the original language, probably. Now, Middle English is different. Like I said, the other languages that had come in between, when Old English was introduced to Britain and when Middle English became kind of the primary language spoken in Britain, was the French is starting, especially the French is going to take away some of the characteristics of Old English that make it especially complex and different from the language that we speak now. Like there was sort of this and I'm blanking on the term, but sort of like an inflection that each word would have based on the rest of the sentence. And we don't really have that anymore. And so now when I'm looking at this, this is something that I can recognize. Like I can't see this text very well over here because it's so small, and I probably wouldn't be able to read it just because of the font. But over here, I can read this. And some of these words I recognize. This looks like April. This looks like March. This is root, flower, hath. I mean, it's old timey, but that's still in English, I know. Melody, and I have memorized this part, so I kind of already know what these words are. But I think even if I didn't, I'd be able to recognize this to some extent, because it is so similar to the English that we speak today. So, for example, if you wanted to read Chaucer in Middle English, like if you wanted to read it in the original language, it would take you a lot longer probably to read it than in a contemporary translation, but you would be able to figure out what it said probably, right? Especially if you had footnotes. Dream of the Rood. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about our first work of the semester, our first literary work. Dream of the Rood is a dream poem. And we actually don't know when it's from or who it's by. So this is going to be something that we assume is from around the 7th to 8th century. And we know it was around as early as the early 8th century because it's carved onto a cross. Not the whole poem, but sections of the poem are carved onto the cross. This Rothwell cross that is pictured here. And so we know that it must have been around then. But we actually know a lot more of this poem because we discovered, and I keep saying we as if I'm British, but people, historians, people who study whatever, discovered a manuscript in 1822 that had what is considered the full version of this poem with 156 lines. And so that's going to be the version that we'll be reading for class. Although technically, I mean, we're not reading the Old English version, and we're not even reading some of the older translations. I wanted to share, and I shared with you, different from the textbook, a version that I think is a little easier to understand. So, if it's going to be a translation anyway, we might as well get one that's like more contemporary. So Dream of the Rood, like I said, it's going to be describing a dream vision. And what happens is this person is describing, like a dream that they're having, right? And we get a sense that this kind of like very middle ages type of image of a person who's wandering, maybe like in exile, and then they have this vision, and it's not of Jesus speaking to them or a human witness, but is of the cross that Jesus was crucified on, telling its story, this inanimate object, its story of its participation in the crucifixion. Okay. And so there's a few things that are kind of interesting about this. And so, yeah, rood means cross, by the way. I think I skipped over that. Um, so one of the things that I really wanted to make sure that we pointed out about this poem is that we really see how Christianity is interpreted. And, I mean, not to be sort of adapted, right, to Anglo-Saxon culture here. And so we're seeing Jesus as presented as this warrior, and he's strong, and he goes into hell, and he frees the people there, their virtuous souls, the people trapped in hell. And it's like, definitely he is resembling more of what would be considered like heroic or ideal to Anglo-Saxons. And maybe we would have a different version now, or maybe in between, maybe that sounds great to us now, but maybe in between now and then there have been some other versions that would feel more appropriate to how we would think of Jesus. And so one of the things that I think is kind of a fun or interesting kind of way of looking at this is through the kenning. And so kennings are going to be um, it's going to be a concise compound or a figurative phrase, and it's replacing a kind of common noun. So, for example, the word cross um, is going to be replaced by triumph tree. And so here we have two words that are, and there's a lot more information here if you want to learn about what all these words mean, like if you're interested in the linguistic, information behind this. But we have two words that are creating sort of a creative depiction of what this noun represents or what this noun is. And then we can figure it out through sort of the context or through when we put these words together, we're like, oh, wow. So anyway, like speech bearer is another one that we'll see here. We're going to have more famous and I think better examples of kennings in some of our future poems. So I'll be sure to point those out as well, especially if you're filling out your bingo card. Okay, and then the other thing that I want to point out about this is that it's using alliterative verse. And so what that means is if you've heard of alliteration, it's a repeated consonant sound at the beginning of the word. And so we will see this throughout the poem, and it's usually going to be in the center of the line. This poem isn't going to be as good of an example of this type of verse as some of the ones we're going to read soon, like Beowulf. And so I'll point it out more, and we can talk more about what the structure means then. But basically, look at each of these lines. What's happening here, instead of using rhyme at the end of the line, like we'll see with later poems, it's in the middle is where they're going to have these kind of back-to-back consonants repetitions. And so you'll see words that are all starting with S, for example, or something like that. Okay, and it's going to be that's how they're determining the meter, and it's actually pretty complex. Okay, so we're going to move ahead quite a bit. I hope that you understand, like I hope that you're like kind of on this ride with me where you're seeing how these are connected, because the truth is that I really wasn't sure how I was going to be able to fit in women mystics into our unit, because I am trying to keep it maybe focusing on the absolute most important works, but I do think that you need to know who these women are and what this was about, and it gives us a lot of good context. And I think with the theme this week of Dream of the Rood, this is a good kind of companion to read is Julian of Norwich. So she was around much later than the poem, the Dream of the Rood was written, circa 1342 to 1416, and she was a mystic and anchoress. So basically, what that meant is that she had these spiritual visions, and dedicated her entire life to her spiritual life. She broke away from the world. And so what she did was she had herself sealed up into a room connected to a church. Literally, they sealed the door and then did burial rites, last rites. And she just spent the rest of her life sort of reflecting on the visions that she had and trying to find meaning in them. So these visions happened, and this is kind of what we know about her. The visions happened when she was 30 and a half. We don't know a lot about her life. People say maybe she had kids because of the way that she talks about mother, which we're going to talk about in a second, but we really don't know because she didn't really write about herself. She just described the visions that she had. And so we know that she had them at 30 and a half. She writes about the vision shortly after she has them, and then she writes a much longer version decades later. And so these visions are going to be described in Revelations of Divine Love. And this is going to be her significant work. I had to include a picture of her with a cat because, and I'm sorry, I'm probably saying this wrong because this isn't my religious background, but she is considered sort of like a patron of cats. And She's not an official saint, from what I understand, but she is celebrated in lesser feast or something like that in in Church of England and Episcopal Church. Okay, so in terms of what's significant about her writing, so she wrote about her visions, like I said. What's really significant is this description of God or Jesus as mother, God and or Jesus, kind of depending on you know. Anyway, so she's talking about God as this like very compassionate person or compassionate figure, and um, this isn't necessarily like the first, she's not the first person to point this out, like God's role as mother. But she is saying it in a way that is very maybe like easy to understand. It's very well said, is maybe the best way of saying it. Subtly and resonantly explored, as the Norton Anthology describes it. So this is something she's known for. The other thing that, and it's all connected, but the other thing that people kind of point out about her philosophy is this idea that sin is behovely. And the idea here is that sin is inherent to humanity. Like we're going to sin. And so God knows that. And he basically expects us to sin. And he is willing to wait until we have matured spiritually and are past this phase of sinning. And it's a very compassionate view of God. She has this famous quote that I think is pretty, demonstrative of like this type of religious philosophy that she has: all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. If you've heard that before. And it's, sounds great, very positive, very compassionate. I wouldn't expect somebody who's, stuck in a basically a tomb next to a church to be so positive. So it's kind of eye-opening. So Margery Kempe is definitely someone to know. She is another woman mystic. And the thing is that I like to make sure that you know about Julian of Norwich as well, because these are going to be really different women mystics, even though they're living contemporaneously. So Margery Kempe was born around 1373 and lived till 1440-ish. We don't actually know when she died. And she was a mystic, but she was not an anchoress. She did not live in a tiny little tomb attached to a church. She lived, or well, she did a bunch of pilgrimages and she lived a very public life. She was definitely not restricted to a small room. One of the things she's very famous or infamous for is her weeping, her displays of weeping. And so this is something that, a lot of people I think saw as demonstrating her direct connection to God, right? Her closeness through her physical, it's so pronounced, it's like coming through her physically. And some clergymen found that this was taking away from their own credibility because they thought, well, people are so in awe of her when she's weeping, in public that, makes us look bad because we don't have that kind of profound physical connection to God. So, there was definitely some hostility towards her and her behavior. Julian was notably very calm in her presentation. And is even considered something that she's potentially doing strategically because she was in such a precarious position as a woman. Women were not supposed to at this time preach or interpret the Bible, and so these women were able to sort of get around this because their experiences were so sensual, sensory, and so of their body. So them experiencing the pain that Jesus felt during the crucifixion, for example, and then describing that as like this vision that they were having and this physical sensation that they were experiencing, it kind of fits more in with this idea of women as, as more, lower creatures who are of their bodies rather than like men who have the greatness of their minds, for example, which is gross. And I wish I hadn't just had to say that. But that is, that's kind of how they got around it. At the same time, she was still very controversial and she was tried for heresy. Let's talk a little bit about why that might not have stuck. So she was the daughter of the mayor. And so we know that she probably had a little bit more lenience, was allowed to kind of have a more breaking the rules kind of lifestyle because of her class status. And she also married not like a high status guy, but somebody who was like at least middle class, considered at that time. And so she had a lot of power as a result compared to potentially, another woman who might have gotten in a lot more trouble for this stuff. Her vision started after the birth of her first child, and she talks about this profound darkness that she experienced, potentially some sort of psychosis that she was going through. And then Jesus appeared at the foot of her bed. And after that, she just kind of had this profound relief. And that just changed her life. And then she starts to kind of have these visions, forever or whatever. And this kind of connection with God. One thing that's kind of important to note here is that we actually know a lot about Margery Kempe because she wrote what's considered the first or one of the first, depending on where you're reading it, autobiographies in English. And so that's pretty significant, right? We didn't know a lot about, or we don't know a lot about what women's life was like back then. Um, they weren't they weren't writing a whole lot, and certainly not women of even like middle class, right? So, and she wasn't writing this, by the way. She was illiterate, which means um, she wasn't able to write. So she could read probably some, probably not like books, maybe, but like she could like read some words. And so she had other people write for her. Okay. If, like me, you want to know everything about these women, I did include some links here. There is this podcast on Margery Kempe from the London Review of Books, and there is this podcast on Julian of Norwich from Yale Divinity School. And then there's also this, I mean, slightly less reputable, but Wikipedia has a really good description of alliterative verse. You can find other sources, but I really thought this one was pretty well explained. Hopefully this was helpful to you, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what everybody thinks in this week's discussion board. All right, have a great week.